This is a dramatic image that went viral at the end of 2022. From its greatest recorded extent in 1987, the Great Salt Lake had lost about 60% of its surface area. This isn't a new problem. Unfortunately, it's not even a rare problem. Of the list of lakes that are in the process of disappearing, the Great Salt Lake is the fifth largest, behind the Aral Sea in Central Asia, Lake Chad in West Central Africa, Qinghai Lake in northwest China, and Lake Urmia in northwest Iran. Each one of these lakes have become ecological hazards, which have had environmental and economic impacts. So then, if the problem of disappearing lakes is so widespread, why did this image of the Great Salt Lake garner so much extra attention? Of the disappearing lakes that I mentioned, the Great Salt Lake is in the most developed part of the world. More developed nations tend to be more environmentally conscious. They have a lot more funding, expertise, public education, and awareness to work with in order to prevent major climate catastrophes. Utah is highly connected with its environment. It is consistently ranked as the happiest state in the United States, thanks in no small part to its connection with the outdoors, ranking highest for outdoor recreation in the entire country. The Great Salt Lake, through something called the lake effect, provides Utah's mountains with the high-quality powder that makes it a major skiing and snowboarding destination. Utah's outdoor recreation creates tens of thousands of jobs and generates billions in revenue each year for the state of Utah. So, the Great Salt Lake has garnered so much focus because it's the perfect case study for conservationists. It's in a developed part of the world with the resources and awareness necessary to fix the problem and with the economic incentive to do so. Now, this isn't the first time the Great Salt Lake has hit critically low levels. In fact, if we're going to be fair about the comparison, we have to acknowledge that this dramatic image compares the highest recorded level of 4,112 feet in 1986 to the recorded low of 4,188 feet in November of 2022. The previous low occurred in 1963 when it dropped to 4,191 feet. In the 1960s, there was some concern about the lake levels, but nowhere near the same amount of attention as today. And despite some plans to restore lake levels, very little seemed to be done about the issue, and seemingly, all on its own, the lake naturally grew over the next couple decades with excess runoff due to higher precipitation. This brings us to our first question about the Great Salt Lake: fluctuating lake levels. There are nearly 160 years of recorded lake levels to refer back to, and as you can see on this graph, the Salt Lake's levels change a lot. In fact, using data from tree rings, amongst other things, hydrologists created a 600-year history reconstruction of water levels. As you're probably correctly assuming right now, tree ring size is proportional to how favorable growing conditions are in a particular year. And as you are correctly assuming, years in which there is plentiful rainfall, trees grow more than in years of drought. All of this information tells us one thing: the Great Salt Lake is constantly fluctuating. And this is the first roadblock in having an open conversation about the Great Salt Lake's water levels. Frequently, people point to the long history of changing lake levels. We'll get into why this occurs in a moment, but these people, which I'm going to refer to as hands-offers, are correct. The lake is always changing, and it always has. The problem is that the population has grown so much in this area that any changes to the lake level has impacts on local residents. Whether it is through flooding or drought, millions of lives are impacted. Just as ocean levels have always changed, we're now so civilizationally advanced and populated that humans can't easily pick up their belongings and shelters and move like they used to. Without even realizing it, by building out so quickly, we have placed limits on what are considered acceptable water levels. Over the long history of the Great Salt Lake, water levels have been higher than they were in 1986, which is the recorded high, just as they have been lower than in the recorded low in 2022. Based on the available scientific data, by now, we are so intertwined with our environment that there is a narrow band of acceptable lake levels where any higher than 1986 would result in flooding, and any lower than in 2022 results in wildlife destruction and potentially toxic dust storms. We'll touch more on the adverse effects of a disappearing lake later, but first let's look at why the lake's level is constantly changing. The primary feature that makes the Great Salt Lake so unique is that it is extremely shallow. The average depth of the lake is about 14 feet, whereas the deepest point is only about 34 feet. For its size, it's one of the shallowest lakes in the world, and just comparing the profile of the Great Salt Lake to other lakes in the region, it really stands out as a very shallow lake. This means that its surface area to volume ratio is very extreme, so the lake loses a lot of water each year just due to evaporation. Some estimates show that up to 10% of the total water in the lake is lost just due to evaporation. And since the lake is so shallow, each foot that the lake drops in water level accounts for approximately 44 square miles of lake bed that is exposed. In some areas, this means that the shore can be pushed back an entire mile. In the course of a normal year, the lake is expected to lose 2 to 3 feet of water, which means that the shoreline is pushed back a few miles between wet seasons. The second feature of the Great Salt Lake that we want to cover is that it is an inland lake, meaning it has no outlet. Most lakes have a way of returning to the ocean, but there is a fairly significant portion of the earth in which this is not true. The Great Salt Lake sits in what we call an endorheic basin, which you will see shaded in gray in this map. In all of these gray regions, water that enters can only leave by evaporation. It's like a giant geographical bowl where precipitation enters, but water is trapped until it can escape through evaporation. Now, if you remember the drying lakes that I mentioned in the beginning of this video, every one of them sits in an endorheic basin. Interestingly, almost all of these gray regions aren't known for having high levels of precipitation. If they had enough precipitation, they would cease being endorheic basins because if you fill up a bowl with enough water, eventually it overflows. To highlight this point, if we look back about 30,000 years, this entire region where the Great Salt Lake sits now was almost completely covered by what we call Lake Bonneville. Now, I'm going to drastically oversimplify this, but Lake Bonneville began to form somewhere around 30,000 years ago, from similar elevations that we see the Great Salt Lake at today. Lower average temperatures reduced the rate of evaporation, and increased precipitation produced more runoff. So, over the course of several thousand years, the lake continued to grow until reaching its peak around 18,000 years ago. The ancient shoreline is still visible along the Wasatch Front mountain range. As mentioned before, this is when the lake stopped being endorheic. It got so full that it began flowing through Red Rock Pass in what is now eastern Idaho. This outlet flowed through the northwestern United States until it eventually found its way to the Pacific Ocean. Something dramatic occurred around this period known as the Bonneville Flood. The short version is that the natural dam near Red Rock Pass collapsed, which led to massive amounts of water flowing out of the lake and into the ocean. Lake Bonneville lost about 430 feet of water until settling again at the level that created the Provo shoreline. Water continued to flow out of Lake Bonneville to the ocean through the same route. Then, for the next few thousand years, the lake entered into what is called a negative water cycle, which just means that the amount of water lost by evaporation and outflow was not made up for by precipitation and inflows. Eventually, the lake dropped enough in level that it no longer had any outflows and became the endorheic lake that we recognize today. The interesting part of this is that scientists consider Lake Bonneville an anomaly, a perfect storm of sorts in which multiple factors came together to create an enormous lake. So, if we consider Lake Bonneville as the unlikely but possible scenario, one might assume that the lake could easily dry up due to natural causes. I've been unable to find anything to point to this being something that has occurred in the past, but one might conclude that it is possible that there may have been a point in the past several 100,000 years in which the lake completely dried up on its own. And once again, this is where some individuals conclude that since all of these things can happen naturally on their own, why should we be worried about fluctuating lake levels? Well, this returns us to where we started. Why does this matter to us? As I mentioned earlier in the video, the economic importance of the Great Salt Lake is well known across the state of Utah. So it's not a debate of whether or not it's important to protect the lake, but more of a question of will our efforts even be worth it? You see, if we look back to 1986 again, the highest lake level since these areas were settled, There were fears of unmitigated lake growth, so much so that the state government spent large sums of money setting up pumps on the western edge of the lake. They were worried that the lake would just continue growing as it had been for the prior 20 years. The pumps were used to pump excess water out into the West Desert where they could let this water just evaporate away. The problem is that these pumps were not used for very long. As we know, the lake began to decrease in size naturally due to less rainfall, and many taxpayers felt like the lake pumps were a wasted expense. Never mind the fact that these same taxpayers were just panicking the year earlier that their homes would be flooded. So there is credence to naturally fluctuating lake levels, but the more concerning fact is that human water consumption just keeps increasing. The difficulty is that water that is diverted away from streams and rivers, primarily for agricultural use, doesn't return to the lake. You see, when water is used for crops, the water used for crops never returns to the local water system. A lot of it just evaporates away, leaving the Endorheic Basin entirely. With human water consumption increasing, the average level of the lake will always be lower than it would have been if the area were never settled. What we're likely to see then is highlighted by this graph. We will continue to see fluctuating water levels, but we will probably see a continuous trend downward until water conservation and regulation take hold. There have already been successful water conservation incentives put into place, and the Great Salt Lake has increased by about 6 feet since the lowest level in November of 2022. A large portion of this is due to the wettest year on record during the winter of 2022 through 2023, followed by another above average year in 2023 through 2024. What we're probably going to see is the regular natural fluctuations we will always see, followed by years in between in which the lake continues to reach new lows as the population continues to increase. While this is not ideal, it does give time for plans to be designed and implemented. By the mere nature that people have settled across this region of the United States, there have been artificial limits placed on how high the lake can safely get so people's homes aren't flooded, and on how low the lake can safely get so the local ecology and economy isn't wrecked. Scientists believe that independent of climate change, there is enough water to preserve the lake at safe levels and satisfy human consumption. Due to the lake's volatile nature, this is going to be a very active area of environmental engineering for the future. The best case scenario is that appropriate actions can be taken to protect the lake for both human and wildlife needs. Hydrologists and conservationists believe that the appropriate minimum water level for the Great Salt Lake is 4,198 feet above sea level. As it stands at time of recording, it's about 4,195 feet above sea level. This gives about 7 feet of buffer room from the most recent low that we saw in 2022, but still puts us short of what the goal should be.